The book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, begins by discussing an idea summarized in a simple phrase. Wealth is a mindset, poverty is a mindset. And this idea, which you will grasp after reading the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, leads to finding people in life who start from scratch and achieve millions. And others who inherit great wealth but end up bankrupt or drowning in debt. Here comes the comparison between the rich mindset and the poor mindset, through a story narrated by the author Robert Kiyosaki, where he says, "I had two fathers, a rich father and a poor father, and from this story, the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, begins. One of them had the highest degrees and the other did not complete his secondary education. Both worked hard and succeeded in their fields. But the former lived his life struggling with difficult circumstances and died leaving behind debts that burdened his family, while the latter managed to amass millions and died leaving behind a great fortune for his family and charitable organizations. The irony between them is that despite both emphasizing the importance of education, the former insisted on the importance of academic education, and the latter on the importance of life teachings in addition to academic education. Both of these fathers gave him advice, and these advices were vastly different. So, these thoughts wandered in the mind of this boy, revisiting them repeatedly and measuring in his mind each of what the fathers said. One of the fathers says, "Money is the root of all evil." And the other says, "Lack of money and poverty is the root." One of them continues to say, "I can't do that." And the other says, "How can I do that?" So, the ideas clashed in the mind of this boy, to ponder them repeatedly and compare in his mind each of what the fathers said. One of the fathers says, "Study hard to find a reputable company to work for." And the other says, "Study hard to find a reputable company to buy." The first father advises him, "Stay in the safety circle," while the other encourages him and says, "Learn risk management." These differences that filled his mind made him realize that his poor father was poor because of his thinking and his view of money as something insignificant. And likewise, his rich father was rich because of his thinking and his view of money, considering it as something important and essential in this life. He learned then that striving for a wealthy life is a legitimate right, with no shame in it at all, but rather it is the pursuit of any person who sets his ambition in this goal. As for bankruptcy, it is just a temporary matter that passes in life, and you can overcome it. While poverty is a mindset that condemns you to eternal suffering. The rich father had 6 simple lessons. These lessons are guiding principles to help you move towards wealth regardless of what is happening in a world that is rapidly changing. And I will explain them to you fully in this article, summarizing the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And these lessons are: the first lesson from the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the rich don't work for money. Robert asked his father, "How can I become rich?" This is likely the same question you asked yourself at the beginning of reading the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. His father looked at him, then thought for a moment, and said to him, "If you want to be rich, you must learn how to make money, and to do that, you must use your mind." The boy decided to follow his father's advice, so he went to his close friend Mike and offered to become his partner in business and learn together how to make money. Thus, their first project began. The boys started collecting metal cans from neighbors, and after collecting a sufficient amount, they began melting the metal to extract nickel from it and pouring it into molds to make counterfeit coins. But the project ended on the day of its completion when Robert's father told them that this was illegal and they couldn't make money this way. If they wanted a real answer, they should go to Mike's father and learn from him. So, the boys went to Mike's father, who offered them to work for him to learn how to make wealth. He gave them only 10 seconds to accept his offer. The rich cannot achieve wealth if they hesitate and cannot make decisions. Immediately, the boys accepted the offer, and thus began their journey of learning. Their work involved arranging and cleaning cans for 3 hours every Saturday in Mike's father's store, and they were paid only 10 cents per hour. Every week, Robert took his pay and went to buy 3 children's magazines, and by midweek, he found himself broke and had read all his magazines. He waited with boredom for Saturday to come so he could go to work without learning anything new and for a meager wage. Robert told his father what was happening. His father got angry, and his anger reflected on his son, who rushed to Mike's house and told him that his father had to increase his salary or he would quit. Mike's father smiled at him and told him that his father knew that Robert would say this someday and that he wanted to meet him next Saturday to discuss the matter. When the meeting came, Robert found himself burning with anger. Here he was, after 4 weeks of hard work, standing once again behind Mike's father's office door, and his mind telling him that he had been exploited for a whole month for a meager wage, without learning anything about making money. As soon as Robert entered the office, he burst into tears and began to tell Mike's father everything that weighed on his chest, and the other listened to him calmly. When Robert finished, Mike's father told him to stop blaming him and to wait in his mind for the available solutions. So Robert told him that either he would increase his salary or he would leave the job. Mike's father replied that he was thinking like all the employees who had worked for him. At some point in their professional lives, they decided that the salary was not worth the effort of work. So they began to complain, and they ended up either leaving the job and looking for another one to complain about later, or they accepted the reality and continued to work to make money and nothing else. The child asked him about the solution. Since there were only these two options, Mike's father told him that running after jobs and wasting life in pursuit of money is what makes people drowning in debt and poor all their lives. And here lies the first lesson from the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. That the rich don't work for money, but money works for them. So, the boy understood the first lesson well, and here Mike's father made him a new offer. To work for him for 3 hours every Saturday, without any pay. The boy agreed with a smile, and his friend agreed as well. So the boys continued to work without compensation, and after 3 weeks, they met Mike's father for the first time since their last conversation. Mike's father suggested to the boys to walk with him, and he bought ice cream for them. They arrived at a public park and sat on one of its benches, and Mike's father began to speak. He asked them about their feelings about working without pay, and then the boys knew that a new lesson was about to appear. Mike's father offered the boys to pay them 25 cents for every hour they worked in the store. The boys refused, knowing that this was undoubtedly a trap. Then he offered them $1 per hour of work. Robert felt his heart beating rapidly in his chest, as this amount was huge for a child at that time, and despite his feelings, he again refused with his friend. Mike's father smiled cunningly and made them another offer that made the hearts of the two boys almost jump and dance with joy in front of him, which is to give them $5 per hour. The offer was irresistible even for an adult, let alone a 9-year-old child. And despite all the rosy dreams that were forming in front of Robert's eyes, he realized the purpose of his rich father, so he rejected it and did what Mike did. And here, the rich father began to talk to them about the job trap, and how people often fall into it for two main reasons, summed up in 2 words: desire and fear. The desire to own the best and brightest things, and the fear of losing those things once owned. The difference between the rich and the poor is their reaction to each emotion of these 2 emotions. For the poor, their reaction is to search for a job and panic about not having one, while the reaction of the rich is to think and search for a way for money to work for them. And because the 2 children understood the first lesson well, their young minds began to work on finding a project through which they could apply the lesson and transfer it to the practical arena. And that's what they did when they asked for permission to use some free magazines that were not allowed to be sold from the store. They set up a small children's library under the house stairs, arranged the magazines, and offered any child to come and read whatever they wanted from the magazines for 2 hours for only 10 cents. And so their project began to generate a lot of money for them. They enlisted Mike's younger sister to be the librarian in their absence for $1 per week, and they were able to collect $9 each week without even working. The second lesson from the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad: why is financial education taught? The rich buy assets, the poor buy liabilities. This sentence summarizes the content of the second lesson from the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. The poor, in their way of thinking, believe that assets are represented by the properties they live in and the cars they drive, while the rich understand that the true asset is the one that generates money for them, not the one they spend money on. This is what Robert thought about when he wanted to buy a car for his wife after he got a good amount of money, and before he went ahead with the purchase, he remembered his rich father's lesson. The rich buy assets, the poor buy liabilities. The car is a liability, as it will not generate money for him, and it will require a lot of expenses later on, which made him change his decision and invest his money in buying an asset. And after 4 years, this asset taught him enough money to invest in other assets and also to buy the car he wanted for his wife. This is one of the rules that no one learns in school, as the school system focuses on producing employees worthy of work who spend their salaries on liabilities. There are no people with capable minds to create the same job and acquire assets that cover their expenses without spending their time on them at all. And although buying a house is not a bad or wrong thing, the right behavior for a rich person would be to find an asset to invest his money in, so that he can cover the installments of that house and cover its expenses, without spending all his income on it monthly, where the same empty loop repeats itself between a job, a salary, and spending without any development or change in the living conditions. The third lesson from the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad: think about your own business. To understand this lesson, we can shorten a story in the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, narrated by one of Robert's friends. Ray Kroc, the founder of the McDonald's restaurant chain, was asked one day to give a lecture to master's students at the University of Austin, Texas, USA. After the lecture, Kroc accompanied the students to one of the clubs they liked to visit from time to time, and they had a conversation where Kroc asked them if any of them knew what their field of work was. The students laughed, thinking that Kroc was joking with them, but he was serious in his question and repeated it. "Does anyone know my field of work?" One of the students answered that everyone knows that he works in managing McDonald's restaurants. Kroc laughed and told them that his real job was in real estate, and managing the restaurant chain was his profession. This information is from outside the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And the difference between work and profession is significant. Because a profession is the skills you learn and practice to be able to perform a specific task that you can make money from. As for work, it is what you do based on your own desire and personal talents, and it is your key to wealth. This lesson was ingrained in Robert's mind, as his rich father taught him since he was a child when he told him to focus on his own business alongside his profession. He was able, by following this advice, to start his own company in the field he loves, instead of spending his whole life in a career he has no interest in except for the monthly salary he receives at the end of each month. This practically sums up the essence of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. The fourth lesson from the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad: the history of taxes and the influence of corporations. The fourth lesson from the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, can be summarized as a Robin Hood approach to taxes. Taking money from the excessively wealthy and giving it to the poor and needy. It may seem wonderful, and this is what people thought at the beginning of the emergence of tax laws that promoted the idea of funding the country's needs by deducting a percentage of the wealthy's wealth. Everyone voted for this law because it was believed to achieve some form of social justice. However, many overlooked the idea that dealing with money requires study, and if you study your finances well and gain more experience in dealing with money, you will find many ways to pave your way towards more wealth. Without delving into the shifting sands represented by tax laws and losing your money. This is what the wealthy did, and after years passed, taxes began to consume more from those with average incomes than from the wealthy. The career ladder filled with promotions and increases became just a set of tax traps for the employee with average income, with each trap being larger than its predecessor. All of this was due to their lack of understanding of the importance of possessing financial intelligence, which the wealthy worked hard to possess and exploit in understanding their country's tax laws in order to maintain and continue to develop their wealth. For example, one provision of the tax code in America states that a person who sells their property in exchange for buying another property at a higher cost and with a material benefit is exempt from taxes. Exploiting this provision exempts the owner from paying taxes on the sale of properties, which could be as high as 35%, and ensures the growth of their assets and the expansion of their investment portfolio instead of remaining confined to a narrow space due to taxes. This is what the wealthy constantly think about. This is one of the lessons from the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, that the rich father wanted to teach, as the importance of financial literacy far exceeds the academic culture that everyone insists on adopting. When you possess financial intelligence, your path to wealth becomes smoother, and the obstacles before you have less impact on you. The fifth lesson from the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad: the rich invent ways to make money. This lesson from the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, will be easier to understand when I present the following scenarios to you. The incident occurred during a break from writing for Robert, as he watched some television programs, and by chance, Robert came across two programs that presented completely conflicting ideas. The first program was about Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. When demand for his new invention began to increase and exceeded the capacity of his small company, he approached one of the major corporations, Western Union, and asked them to buy the patent for his invention and his small company, so that he could meet the growing demand for his invention. However, the giant corporation rejected his request at that time, and now his invention is the basis for some of the greatest fortunes in the 21st century. The second program was a segment of the evening news featuring a story about an organization downsizing, which led to the layoff of a significant number of employees. These disgruntled workers gathered outside the organization's door protesting the injustice done to them by its owners. Among them was a man in his mid-40s with his 2 children and wife, pleading with the guards to allow him to speak with the company's owners, as his life would be ruined if he lost his current job. Where is the contradiction in these two scenarios? Let me explain. The first program tells the story of a person who has an idea through which he can make money, while the second tells the story of a person whose life is tied to the fate of a company that could collapse at any moment without warning. Here lies the fundamental difference between the rich and the poor. The poor wait for opportunities to knock on their door, while the rich create them out of nothing. The poor work for money, and the rich invent ways to get it. As a simple example of applying this idea, Robert tells us a small story that happened to him in the early 1990s when the economy was in a very difficult situation. At that time, Robert was looking for an opportunity to buy real estate among bankruptcy cases and auctions. He found someone who wanted to sell his house for about a quarter of its original price because he needed to pay off his debts quickly. At that time, Robert borrowed some money from a friend, promising him a small percentage after he returned it to him within 90 days. He then spent the amount on a lawyer and an advertisement for the house being offered. Robert offered the house for $60,000, focusing on the fact that the house was valued at $75,000 in his advertisement. This made the deal attract widespread interest among potential buyers. Soon enough, Robert managed to sell the house and paid $20,000 to the original homeowner. He then returned the borrowed amount to his friend and made a significant profit without spending any significant amount. Despite the economic downturn at that time, Robert was able to make substantial profits because of his way of thinking and his innovation in ways to make money. This is the essence of the fifth lesson from the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Even if you don't have anything, you can start and work hard until you achieve great goals. While the poor continue to wait for circumstances to improve, opportunities to multiply, and money to rain down on them from the sky before they start, and they may never start. The sixth lesson from the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Let your work be aimed at learning, not just making money. Building on the first lesson, which stated that the rich don't work for money, it is logical for the last lesson to emphasize the importance of considering work as an opportunity for learning and development, not just a means of making money. Perhaps this is one of the most important lessons in the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. This is what the rich dad taught Robert, who understood that everyone should learn something from everything, and that wealth cannot be achieved by someone who does not want to learn. Things that people may not consider important because they do not fall within the prestigious academic fields societally, such as sales and business systems, may actually be the dividing line between poverty and wealth. As an example, Robert would always ask his students if any of them could make a better hamburger than McDonald's, and most of them would raise their hands. Then, Robert would ask them why they couldn't earn more money than McDonald's when they could make a better hamburger. The reason is simple. It's because they don't understand business systems, and this is the strength of the rich over the poor. They care about everything related to presentation, sales, and commerce, and they excel in sales and marketing. They don't belittle any knowledge or information that could take them out of their specialization circle and enable them to achieve many successes, while the poor remain trapped in their field of specialization. This is exactly what happened with the journalist who asked Robert for advice about her books, which were not gaining popularity despite her having high academic qualifications that should have made her one of the best authors. Robert advised her to enroll in a sales course, but the journalist found it strange and outside her expertise. She rejected his advice, even though he was the author of best-selling books, simply because the field was outside her expertise and she didn't see any benefit in it. Learning things outside your area of expertise doesn't mean abandoning your specific goal. but it means reaching it more strongly and having an additional advantage that others with a poor mindset don't have. And with that, we have concluded the summary of the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Follow along because opportunity awaits you.